Live from Nina today. Now, Ian O'Doherty is a columnist and writer for the Irish Independent. He penned a very thought-provoking article recently in the Spectator magazine about unease in the country, where people are complaining of feeling increasingly unsafe. And he joins me online now. Ian, good morning to you.
Good morning, how do you do?
I'm very well indeed, and thanks for coming on with us today. We were taken with your article because we've had many discussions, Ian, on the programme about people feeling fearful, but we received criticism that by doing so we're stoking tensions just by acknowledging that.
Well, that's the great trick that's often played to keep people quiet. And the days for that trick are over. They're gone. It's very much a luxury to believe. It's a luxury belief to say, "Oh, sure, everything is fine, and it's only racists, and it's only bigots and xenophobes who have any problem like that." That's simply not the case anymore. You go to any village or town in Ireland that has had an iPass centre gone into it. You'll see that there's a rise of concerns and there's a rise of tensions. You go, and you can't deny basic human nature. This isn't on either side, whether it's the international protection applicants or the locals. And it stands to reason that if you, say, close down the town's last remaining hotel, as has happened on numerous occasions, and you fill it then with 100 or 150 young men who have nowhere to go, who don't have very much money, and who are bored. Well, of course there's going to be concerns, and of course there's going to be tensions. And I do think, though, the people who used to shout everybody else down and accuse everybody of being a bigot and stuff, they're the ones who are looking, frankly, quite silly and obnoxious and stupid. Because it's just absurd to paint everybody with that same brush. And what I would say is that we had a completely, perfectly timed example to prove how racist we are not when you look at the welcome that was afforded to the 100,000 Ukrainian refugees that came over, for example, after the start of the war.
Yes, and exactly as you describe, of course, I'm sure you're well across what happened in Roscrea, but you ended up with the community being completely divided there, largely because of how the people of Roscrea were portrayed in national media, Ian.
Absolutely, and don't forget as well that a lot of those who were saying that everybody else is a bigot and saying that any of the locals in Roscrea had any concerns were just racists. A lot of these people are activists, and they're full-time activists, or they work with NGOs, or they just basically, a lot of them back in the day, we would just call them cranks.
Yeah.
And we need to get back to stop allowing these cranks to bully people. You know, there's a big difference between being some racist who doesn't like somebody based on the colour of their skin to being somebody who's just concerned about a complete and total lack of amenities and a complete transformation virtually overnight of the entire nature of your community. Frankly, if you're not concerned about stuff like that, but then you're just not paying attention. And what we're seeing is the debate, and the media have played their part in this to quite a shameful degree for quite a long time as well. They've conditioned everybody to be afraid to say, well, actually, I'm not really cool with what's going on at the moment. I don't really like that.
Yeah.
Both in print and in radio and in TV, you get journalists, people who do my job, but doing it very badly, I would say, and you get presenters and stuff, and they just sneer at the concerns of local people. It's like, oh, sure, what would you know? You know, isn't it great that we're the most welcoming country in the world? It's like, yeah, well, the thing is, in Dublin particularly, those people don't live in the areas that are affected. You know, it's all very well to sneer at people in Coolock on the north side of Dublin if you're a very well-paid journalist living in Dalkey on the south side of Dublin. And you don't have to worry about anything like that. And that's what I find there's a very sort of middle-class condescension towards both working-class people in Dublin, and that's where most of the accommodations go, and to rural people in Ireland. And I think people are sick of it. And don't forget as well, there's no coincidence that this is written for a magazine in England, you know.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And People really are, and the thing is, you can lecture people, you can shout at people, you can push them around, you can poke them in the chest for so long before they just turn around and they go, you know what, I'm sick of it, I've had enough.
Is there a bit of a sea change? I'm thinking particularly of Jim O'Callaghan, I suppose, and some of what he's been saying recently. Is there a bit of a sea change there that's more reflective in some way of what a large number of people in Ireland are thinking?
Yeah, they know finally that they got it wrong for too long and it went way too far. So now they're trying to roll back a bit, but without admitting that they got it wrong for too long and it went way too far.
And still you had, and you referred to it in the article, the refugee job fair that happened in Croke Park. And many people, again, afraid to call that for what it was, but that certainly was strange, to say the least, was it not?
It was bizarre, and it was funded by the United Nations, so no great surprise there. But if that was just, again, that's the kind of thing that seems like a good idea to the NGOs and the activists. And it seems like a terribly bad idea to anybody with any common sense who wouldn't even necessarily have any strong opinions one way or the other. But if you're looking at what they call the optics of it, and people say, oh, well, we can't get Irish people to do the jobs that we want them to do. Well, that's because there's so many migrants coming in. There's a thing called wage compression, where they're just working for lower than Irish people can afford to work for. So, I mean, let's put it this way. I mean, before, when I was still sort of struggling to get into journalism, I worked in the restaurant industry as a kitchen porter and stuff. And it was a job you could do as a young fella. Even on your summer holidays and stuff like that. You don't get kids doing those jobs anymore. They're all taken. And we can't take in the world. And we have to stop it. And I mean, my take, and I've said it in The Spectator and I've said it in other places, no more money for the NGOs, no more money for international protection and immigration. Because in the course of a generation, we have already changed the face of Ireland and the face of small town Ireland. And I'll give you one sort of very minor example. My wife is from a rural town in Mayo. And even by Mayo standards, I like to say it's seen as being in the sticks, right? It's quite rural. Their last hotel is just, they were told 2 weeks ago, it's becoming an iPass centre. Now that's where everybody in that town had their confirmation on their 21st and their wedding reception there. And that's gone. And are you going to tell the people who are annoyed about that they're racist? And there was another example, and this really brought it home to me a couple of years ago, where there was a hotel that changed over. And this young woman, she was due to get married there that summer. And she came out and she said, we spent so much money and, this is going to be my dream wedding and stuff. And she was told to shut up by the media. And she was told to shut up by the activists and the NGOs and said, oh, do you think your wedding is more important than these people or whatever? And of course she was just mortified and shamed into silence. But she should have turned around and said, well, actually, do you know what? I do think the wedding that I've been planning since I was a child and looking forward to since I was a child is actually quite important because I'm quite important. And I think a lot of the Irish people are going, hang on a second, our concerns count. Stop writing us off. We're not racists, we're not Nazis, we're not bigots, but we're people who live in our own country and we're becoming second-class voices in our own country, and we're not being listened to by the media and we're not being listened to by the politicians, and God damn it, we're not taking it anymore.
And if you say that, you're told that we should embrace diversity, we should be open, and we're told as well about those obligations that we have from Europe, Ian. I mean, how do you answer that?
Well, you look at this is the great line, we have international obligations. Lots of countries have international obligations on lots of different matters. Lots of countries actually do what's best for their own citizens. And I think this is one of the reasons, it's one of the terrible ironies of Irish politics at the moment, is that there's no real strong opposition. And it's the reason why this current government is in power and why they got in a loveless marriage with the Irish electorate at the last election back in December. And
why? Because there wasn't an alternative voice on the big issues that we're discussing. Is that it?
Yeah, there was no real alternative, and it's a pity. And I always said, I mean, this was an election too soon for Ain to or whatever. But I mean, even even that argument that, we have international obligations. It's like, well, what is it? Is it international obligations, or is it our national welcoming spirit that makes us want to be the moral leaders of Europe? Whether it's to do with Israel, or whether it's to do with the Ukraine, or whether it's to do with immigration and refugees, our politicians have a pathological desire to be seen to be the best boys in the class in Europe, so they can hold their heads high when they go to Brussels.
Even if it's to the detriment of the country?
Well, I honestly now think that's how disconnected a lot of them are, and how disconnected a lot of them have become. And I'm sure a lot of your listeners would have noticed that there are certain politicians who almost look in the voters as if they're a nuisance. You know, and I'm passionate about politics, and I'm very romantic about politics, and I have a huge amount of respect for TDs, and I don't like the kind of naked cynicism and the very lazy cynicism that we often express towards TDs. It's a bloody hard job, and we should actually give them the credit for that. So I'm not dismissing them out of hand, but I have seen over the last while, just from writing about and observing politics, the number of career politicians who never really had a proper job, and they just genuinely, and I used to say as a joke, and unfortunately for all of us, it's become more and more serious, the realisation of the amount of them who look at us, the voters, as pretty much a nuisance. And they'd rather get a pat on the head from whatever committee they happen to go over to me to give evidence.
And isn't that really evident in the almost embarrassment about our neutrality, for example?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I mean, you can see it even, to go back to the Ukraine thing, we could end up giving Ukraine 700 million euros.
Yeah.
Right, now we've guaranteed 100 million up front, but if it goes into percentages and pro rata of what the EU contributions have to be, we could end up paying 700 million. And Simon Harris said, well, that's a price worth paying to be on the right side of history. Well, I don't think it is. And I don't know how many Irish people thinking giving out 700 million. And in Irish terms, that will probably end up being $1 billion. You just look at every infrastructure project that we have, right? So charitably say 700 million. I can think of a lot better things that money could go on. And I think, but one of the things I notice is that, as you said about Jim O'Callaghan changing things, I think it was interesting that we saw Micheál Martin admitting that the majority of the asylum seekers are economic migrants. And remember now, it was only 6 months ago saying that you'd be shouted down as a bigot who didn't care about people fleeing war zones. It was very, very telling that he came out and said that, because that was a tacit admission to the public, saying to the public, you know what, you were right all along, but we're not going to make a big deal out of it. When actually the people were right all along, and it is a big deal, and a big deal should be made out of it. And we shouldn't be letting these politicians just blithely walk all over the concerns of working class people in Dublin and rural people in places like Tipperary. I know in Clonmel you have your own problems.
Yeah.
With one of the hotels that's been turned in.
Yeah, and now we're looking at Kilcorn Lodge Hotel again, which is a hotel outside of Care, possibly being used for ICAS.
Yeah, and so the thing is, how can any regime possibly expect to treat its own people like that, with such a flagrant disregard, and not expect them to be immensely cheesed off? And again, don't forget, a lot of the protests that you see against the locals, right? A lot of the activist protests, you'll see the same faces cropping up from town to town. You'll see the same faces cropping up on radio and TV. And we saw a classic example of that on the election debate about immigration that they had an upfront. And one of the people who was condemning the Newtown Mount Kennedy residents, and it turns out she actually worked for a refugee agency. When we had the issues along the Grand Canal, there was this woman who turned up who was advocating for the people who were living along the Grand Canal, where it's now effectively a tent city. And it turns out that she worked for an NGO that was involved with refugees, and now she's back over working for the UNHCR. So there's a professional class of people who, this is what they do. And so when you listen to the activists and the pro-immigration brigade, not all of the time by any means, not all of the time, I hasten to say that, but some of the time to a lot of the time, you're dealing with people that this is virtually their full-time job. And it's one of the great scandals in our society, and this will probably become a much, much bigger issue in the next general election, is how much taxpayer money goes to non-governmental organisations, the NGOs, and how many of them are involved. There's a ridiculous amount of them.
But already any notion of measuring that in some ways has been shot down.
Well, of course it has.
Yeah.
Of course it has. You know...
yeah, because I remember around the election time, I looked through the list of NGOs. My sweet God, the amount of duplication there even, you know?
Oh, yeah, and any attempt to try and gather them all and unify them all under one particular organisation, that's always shot down. Always shot down, because that would mean that there would be job losses. And, you know, there'd be losses of donations. And a lot of them have... sort of rivalries and, you know, internecine feuds and stuff like that. But I think when I first started, a couple of years ago, when I first started hearing the rumblings about the NGOs, and I was actually from a former civil servant, as to be said, who dealt with some of them, I initially thought it couldn't be as bad as I'm being told. I genuinely refused. I couldn't believe it. And it was as bad as I was told, and it was worse, in fact. And it's since become worse. And one of the consequences of that we're seeing is how we now have this shadow government, effectively, that's kind of making these decisions. And people are living, people in Tipperary, people in Mayo, people in Newtown and Kennedy, people in every county in Ireland are living with the migration crisis. People in Dublin will say that there's now quite simply parts of Dublin that are just a no-go zone area. You know, we saw it then with the gang fight on South Anne Street. So South Anne Street in Dublin, like, it's ironically it's just a stone's throw from the Dáil, and it's just, you know, just off Grafton Street, a 2-minute walk to Stephen's Green, lovely part of the city. And there was an African asylum seeker killed in a fight between Africans, effectively, outside a gig. And for the last few years, we've all been told anytime something like this happens, nothing to see here, move along. And we have all moved along because we didn't want to be seen to be prejudiced. And we didn't. And the thing is, now people are realising it's not about prejudice. It's about a situation that isn't working for anybody, not for the locals and not for the asylum seekers. And it has to stop. And when people talk about racists, you're going, if you're stopping the concerns of every ordinary local person, well then you're creating a vacuum. And into that vacuum you will get the bad guys coming in. And if you look at the fact that every election that we have, the so-called far right, you know, people who are accused of being far right, they never get anywhere. They never get anywhere in Irish elections. And the reason why they don't is because we're not a racist people.
Yeah.
But what we are, I think, is we're the trodden people. And we're sick of it. You know? And it's important as well for people to remember that a lot of those condemning you for being a bigot, if you have concerns, they live in the areas that will never ever be affected by this. It doesn't touch them on a daily basis, and therefore they still have the luxury of sneering at anybody who doesn't have the luxury of living in an area that isn't affected by this.
Ian, it was such a pleasure to talk to you today, and really appreciate your time, and thank you for coming on.
Not at all, and thank you, and good luck to your listeners.
Thank you, and bye-bye to you now. That's Ian O'Doherty speaking to us there, particularly about that article that he wrote recently for The Spectator, as I told you. Very, very thought-provoking indeed. Huge reaction to it here on our social media platforms, and thank you for that, and I will get to some of it very soon. But right